Welcome back to another episode of Organic Chemistry. I'm that chemist, and today we're going to talk about ChemDraw again. Today we're mostly going to look at style elements. So if you've ever looked at a paper before, it'll typically have a first figure that you can see in the table of contents, aka the abstract, and the graphic is usually referred to as a table of contents graphic, or a TOC graphic. And so the way that those are typically made is you'll use style elements. Usually the style elements that you see people use are ones that are already present in ChemDraw, and so I'm hoping to talk through some of those. So the first thing to consider is what style you're using. So if you've watched my lectures before, you might have noticed that there's a certain color palette that I use, as well as a certain style of structure. So there's different styles that are available, as I mentioned in the last episode. Now, if you would like access to the one that I use in my videos, you can actually go to the That Chemist Discord and download the That Chemist style. Now, there's some that already exist here. You can see like the Wiley document, etc., ACS 1996. And those will also have colors associated with them, but in the case of the ones that come pre-installed with ChemDraw, they'll just have the default color palette. So if you want to change color palette, that's a thing that we can cover in a future video. It's relatively straightforward. You just have to open the style and then change some of the parameters. But without further ado, let's look at some style elements. So you can see here that I've got this weird looking person drawn with a pigeon and some accessories. What you can do is there's this thing called templates, and so templates come pre-installed in ChemDraw, but you can also get ones that your friends make or that people on the internet have made, and you can get different design elements like this frog. Now you might be doing research related to a frog. You could easily get a frog, and then you could inject the frog with whatever this syringe is supposed to be full of. Okay. You can also get fun if you're bored in class, if you're younger and you don't have to make figures for paper. This can still be a fun way to pass the time. Okay, so let's say we have this reaction here. There's a couple different ways that I like to draw stuff. So one of the ways that I draw reactions is I will have the product, reagents, and the reactant, the product, and the reagents with different colors. Now, another thing you can do if you want to show where certain substituents are coming from, if you color the starting material and the product the same, but then you draw new atoms that were introduced from a reagent with their own color, it can be easier to follow where, for instance, in this instance, this bromine comes from. However, if you're trying to present something into a paper, you might not want too much color. So you might want more of a minimalist style where you just have a couple highlights of color if you want it to look really professional and clean. So some of the different style elements you can use include these structures here, these shapes. And so you can see that there's circles, there's ellipses, there's circular edged rectangles as well as rectangles, and they have a bunch of different colored and faded options. So one of the things you can do though is you can just build with what you like. So like let's say we wanted to use this design and put this around our reaction. We might not want the color to be this way, but we could just expand it. Let's say that we decided we wanted to make it just black. Okay, we can make that black, straightforward enough. Now that it's black, if we decide that we don't want it to be dashed, we can make it into just not dashed, just by unselecting the dash tool by right-clicking and clicking in this first set of options here. You can see that depending on what style you'd like, you can just change the appearance based on that right-click menu. So one of the things that you see in table of content graphics is not this, but rather shadowing. So here shadowing, you can see that the shadow is behind this big box. You can also invert it and have the shadow appear on the opposite side. So you might have noticed this in some of my video thumbnails, for instance. Now, I personally am not a big fan of the solid box with the shadow behind, but I do like dashed with the shadow behind. I actually typically prefer the rounded edge one, however. So what I would do is I would go here to the drawing elements. I would get this rectangular shape with the rounded edges. We could just delete this one here. And then if we move this one up, you can see what this looks like. Okay, so I would usually do shadowed something like this. You could probably notice if you go back and look at my video thumbnails that I have this type of thing quite often. You can also make it bold if you want to have it a little bit thicker, if you want it to stand out more. So if you do something like faded, you'll actually have the color that is present in the outside just there, but just faded. So it isn't too dominant. Now you can see that when I filled in this, it actually covered up the reaction underneath. And so what we can do is press F3. And what F3 does is it sends whatever object you're holding to the back visually. So here, if we were to like put this over top here, you can see it's in the front. If we press F3, it'll go to the back. So you can see that this is behind everything else we've placed. Now, if you want to bring it to the front, you can press F2 and it'll bring it to the front. So F3 to the back, F2 to the front. Okay. So sometimes you want to do circles. So if you have a figure that looks like an Angevant like cover picture, usually they have a big circle with stuff happening. Maybe you have a catalytic cycle you want to draw a circle around. The circle could come in handy. But most of the time you want just usually like rectangles, sometimes rounded, sometimes not. Okay, so a couple other things I didn't cover in the last episode include lone pairs. So let's say that we had tetrahydropyran. So we have an oxygen there, and it's not clear that we have any lone pairs. Unless you're familiar with organic chemistry, it might not be super straightforward to know that you have non-bonding valence electrons. And so here you can see this is what tetrahydropyran would look like with lone pairs. Depending on the style settings, you can change how big the lone pairs are, how far apart they are from the center of the atom, etc. But this is where you do that. Now, when you select an atom, let's say we got rid of those lone pairs. If we had an atom like this and you wanted to make it charged, the way you'd usually see people do this is they just get the plus tool, go over here and click like that. And you can see it's added an H because the oxygen thinks it's protonated now. But another thing you can do is you can just hover over the oxygen, and if you have a numpad on your keyboard, if you press the plus, it will add a positive charge. If you press a minus, it will take away a charge. So if we did something like this, you can see the oxygen has a negative charge, now it's -2, -3, etc. So that's like a little trick that'll come in handy for you. Okay, so there are some other common key commands. I briefly mentioned this, or I briefly used some of these in the last video, and people in the comments were asking about this. So one trick, let's say you wanted to put a nitrogen on this atom. Since you're hovering over it, it knows you're wanting to do something with it. N is understood as nitrogen. If we did an S, it would go for sulfur. If we hold shift and do S, it will do silicon. Now, if you wanted to do selenium, you'd have to enter that manually. But if you have a normal element, it'll usually understand what you're talking about. So let's make this into a thiophene. Let's say we wanted to put a bromine there. We can press B, and it'll just assume that you want to do a bromine. However, if you want to have a boron, you hold shift and press B, and it'll make it into a boron. So that's pretty useful. Now, here you can see I was clicking to add those bonds in. Another thing you can do is if you're hovering over an atom and you press 1, it will add a single bond. If you press 2, it'll make it a double bond. And here you can see it's highlighted in red because it's unhappy that we have a pentavalent carbon. But this also applies for 3, etc. So there's some other useful ones. If we do A, we can add in a benzene ring. And beyond that, there's several other key commands that you can learn and use. Now, most of the time, I tend to use things which clean up reactions, and if you're building stuff all the time, it can be really helpful to just have some key commands because it's a lot easier to do that. So another thing I didn't mention about templates is you can create your own. So here this says new templates. Now, if I go to the section My Compounds, I have made a template called My Compounds. So for certain structural motifs that I found myself drawing quite often, I don't have to draw them every single time. So you can just build them once when you edit your template, and you can just paste it in there. And so now I don't have to build those every single time. There's also some available online that are really useful, such as photoredox catalysts. If you're doing any photocatalysis, wouldn't it be great if you never had to draw Rubippy ever again, right? So that's super useful. Additionally, I've added in some custom ones into mine, such as this decatungstate. As our group does stuff with decatungstate, you can see some of the font sizes are a little bit messed up because they're from different styles than the current style of the That Chemist style. But you could just adjust these so that it would be more global. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is pasting structures into ChemDraw. So here you can see we have this figure. Let's say we're talking to a research group about a reaction. Something that really comes in handy is being able to just paste into ChemDraw. So I just did Control-C to copy this in ChemDraw. It's currently pasting into Microsoft Word. And so now we have our figure in ChemDraw. Now you can center it. The disadvantage is if you do this on a Mac, you can't actually edit it still, but if you're on a PC, if you double click on the structure, ChemDraw will just pop up and then you can continue editing it. So you don't have to export the image as a JPEG or a PNG, it will just still know that this is an embedded ChemDraw file. So it's also possible to do this for PowerPoint. So let's just show an example of that. So here I've copied it, we're going to open PowerPoint, and we have a slide talking about stuff, and easily we have this pasted into PowerPoint. Now if we double click on it, it'll again open ChemDraw. It just might take a minute because ChemDraw is not optimized. And then once ChemDraw is open, we can see that this is here. So let's say I wanted to make this into an acyl chloride, or both of these into acyl chlorides. And then I close this, we just press the little exit button, and you can see now in ChemDraw these are acyl chlorides. So these are some additional tricks, and hopefully this has been helpful for using ChemDraw. If you like this series, there's still more stuff I haven't covered, and I'd be happy to do another future video. It would really help out the channel if you left a like and subscribed, and I hope you have a great day.